Hello, Renegade Marketers. As I've referenced on this show many times and crystallized in my book, Renegade Marketing, being a CMO today is really, really hard. Still, the successful ones are truly the cool cats of marketing. CATS being an acronym for courageous, artful, thoughtful, and scientific. Unless you think the CATS framework only applies to previous guests, I'm thrilled to introduce you to today's guest, Josh Machiz, who takes the idea of renegade marketing to another stratosphere. Josh is a partner at Redpoint Ventures, a VC firm that invests in startups, and as you'll soon learn, has a unique approach to helping these companies grow. Prior to joining Redpoint at the end of 2021, Josh was the head of client engagement at NASDAQ. During his 9 years at NASDAQ, Josh worked with over 100 companies to go public, honing a skill set that I've referenced on this show as being invaluable. So Josh, welcome to the show. How are you?
Drew, I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm delighted. Now, always likes to ground the listeners. Where are you?
I am in New York. I live in Union Square and I've lived here kind of my entire adult life and I love New York.
There you go. Well, this is the New York to New York show, east side to down, there you are, Chelsea. Now, before we get too deep into your current marketing job, we're going to check the Wayback Machine. What was the toughest job you ever had? And what did that experience teach you about yourself?
Oh my gosh, I've had a lot of tough jobs, but certainly starting at NASDAQ when I was very young on the PR team was super intense. Of course, working in an environment where you had to be there not just for the market open, but to make the IPOs happen, which often meant being in at 7 a.m. and not leaving till late nights. It was a really great way to cut my teeth and understand the rigors of the business world. It was honestly, I think, the most shaping thing of my entire career. And the vantage point of getting to sit at an exchange day in and day out was just to learn from the best, whether it was marketing, sales, founders, just great people who are great with press. Just learning from these incredible icons, I think has been honestly the great pleasure of my career.
I want to dig into this a little bit because you had this experience where you were working intensely with people physically. Can you imagine learning the same amount today if you had to do that job virtually?
Oh my gosh, it would take me years longer. I mean, that is the danger of remote work, right? Like what I learned on the job, sitting there in the NASDAQ, sitting there being like, oh, this company's coming in to ring the bell. I'm going to work with their team. They're going to be right here with me. I'm going to meet them in real life. We're going to have an interaction, develop a rapport, all of that stuff that we had, that magic, those magic moments. I feel for every young person today who doesn't have that opportunity, but that's not to say that there isn't great ways to grow in a remote environment, but sure is hard compared to the incredible opportunity I had.
Yeah. I mean, I think about it early in my career, the mentors I had and the quick conversations and am I crazy? And the relationships that were built just because we were face to face and, the trip to the bathroom or the sidebars or the other things where you just got to know people. So my only thought for folks listening is while you love the idea, and I do too, of working at home, if it's early in your career and someone says, maybe you should come in 2 or 3 days a week, don't resist it. It's probably the best thing that'll happen to you. Anyway, enough of that. Okay. Speaking of pre-career, I have to ask, you ended up at McGill. You don't sound Canadian. How'd you end up there?
I am not Canadian. When I was looking at colleges, a friend of mine recommended McGill and it was on my short list of colleges to apply to. And when I was looking at all the different schools in the US that of course, you go with your parents and you go and you check out the school and see what the experience is like. If you ever want to go to Montreal. It's the most beautiful campus in at least in my opinion, of the major top schools. It's one of the most beautiful. It's at the top of the city. The buildings are iconic. The city is such a vibrant one. It was almost like as soon as I went for that visit, my decision was made up and you couldn't tell me otherwise. And I think it was a great choice. In hindsight, the biggest drawback was the the US brand recognition. I thought a lot of people knew McGill, but then I remember when I graduated from college, I'll never forget it. In New York City, I went to like a job fair that Yahoo was putting on, and a recruiter from the New York Times asked me if McGill was a technical school. And I was like, oh, it's super technical. And then I realized that she meant like a Votech school or something of that nature. And I was like, oh, wow. So the brand that I invested my entire college experience into is not known by the head recruiter for the New York Times. So it's like, I realized that right then that they had a brand problem, and maybe they still do a little bit, but I think a lot more people know them today than they did back then.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I know I also have friends whose kids went there, and I know people who went there. It's a great school, top school in Canada. We're doing a shout out to McGill right now on this show because it ranks. It's definitely a quality education. All right. Given that you spent 9 years at NASDAQ, let's talk about your unique path into marketing. I know you mentioned that you started in PR, but your title when you left was a head of client engagement. How'd you get from helping out with PR to becoming head of client engagement in those 9 years?
Yeah, so it was a really long and incredible journey. So when I started at NASDAQ, it was actually after I had worked for the CEO of the Philadelphia Stock Exchange as his chief of staff. And I'd kind of had this interesting moment where essentially I came in through acquisition from the Philadelphia Exchange, that it was acquired by NASDAQ, and had just like an interesting view where I was kind of able to see it from perhaps a little bit of a different perspective. But when I joined the PR team back in 2013, I was at the Bell, and it was such an incredible moment to see all these companies come in and ring it and tell their story. And I was like, where does all this footage go? Like, where is this landing? Is it on Twitter? And I was like, I don't see it. And I didn't see it on Instagram. And I was like, there's this opportunity. They're like, well, we have an intern that posts the photos on Facebook the next day. And I was like, well, the next day is dead on social media. And right then and there, because I had to be at the Bell every day, being, that was part of my job, I literally picked up the keys to Twitter and started posting at the Bell from my phone. And it literally started where we had next to no followers. I had to get the keys from our Instagram back from a kid that was named NASDAQ Jack. And I had to get Instagram to give us the keys back. Like, they just didn't have a very thoughtful social media strategy. And it was also just so nascent that they probably didn't think that it was really that important to the exchange. Cause you're already on CNBC. What do you need to be on Instagram for? Right.
Right. So let's pause there for a second, because there are a
Yeah.
couple of things that I just want to put punctuation points on. One, starting as a chief of staff for kids who are listening or coming out of school is a really interesting place because you get to see a lot more than you might in a very junior level. Second of all, what you did in grabbing the reins when you saw the opportunity, I got to say, is unusual. It's not everybody does that. You had peers who were in PR who didn't do it. So kudos to you for grabbing it. So there was a point in time where you're doing these things, then that's cool. And they're going, yeah, that's nice. Was there a tipping point where suddenly the social started to become something that the marketing folks recognize as, whoa, this is important?
Yeah, I think that's actually kind of my advice to any young person in marketing, is like taking that leap, grabbing the keys, doing that, is something that maybe my chief of staff kind of history taught me to, like, oh, something's not working, let's fix it. But what that did, especially in the early days of social, was all of my marketing colleagues were a little bit just like, oh, whoa, now there's this thing. And it's something that Josh created from nothing. And it really helped accelerate my career. So, I think the other thing it did was it accelerated my career within the industry. A lot of people started posting about how much NASDAQ social media was great and how we were like really just being so much more out there than our competitor at the New York Stock Exchange. And it went from this point of, essentially something that wasn't being used to this point of differentiation. And that, I think, is the magic of what happened with my career and why it was so important. It's funny. It's like followers are a type of currency, but there's so much more than that, right? Like, it wound up being this great opportunity to collaborate with our public companies, with private companies, with the next generation of public companies. It really lent itself to building this incredible platform.
Okay, so
Yeah.
then you sort of built the platform, and then when you left, your title was head of client engagement.
Chief
And
digital
so,
officer and head of
right.
client
And
engagement.
so
Yeah.
how was that sort of a marketing role in some ways? And how, just talk a little bit about, because again, you had social, you had PR, you had social, and now you get to head of client engagement. What's that look like?
Yeah. So, after building the followers, the next thing I started to build was really shows and content. So the first show that I launched for NASDAQ was called Cultural Capital. Every episode had over 1 million views on Facebook. It was essentially MTV Cribs for office spaces. And it all started because Facebook came to me as one of their, bigger creators in the space, at least in the financial business world. And they said, "Hey, can you do produced content?" And I said, "Of course I can. Let me get back to you." And I did the thing that I did way back in the beginning when I started at NASDAQ, which is, let me see if I can figure out how to make beautiful produced content. And so I hired an incredible production company called Space Station that I absolutely love and quite frankly still work with today to help me produce this show. And it was a runaway hit. And what it did for our public companies was show them that they're a great place to work. And then we started expanding it to private companies that would soon go public. And what it did for my brand at NASDAQ was turned me from a marketer to this sales inducement funnel creator, because all of these CEOs would come into NASDAQ and say, I did Josh's show and it was so great for our brand. We got so many leads of new hires and all of this stuff. And I kind of flipped the funnel that didn't really exist previously in terms of just like engaging with the private companies in this way. And so it really became this big competitive differentiator, which is how I knew I didn't really necessarily belong as a core marketer and actually joined the listings team to actually be a part of the process of pitching companies to go public. So I was so involved on the, once they made the decision side before, where I was like working with them on their social media strategies, they geared up for their listing and all that stuff once they'd already made the decision. But what it really did for me, what content did for me, is it solidified that I wasn't just great at marketing. I was great at like helping companies decide that they should choose NASDAQ as their listing venue.
And I'm going to pause on that for a second. So in the book, the T in CATS is for thoughtful. And within that, there's a chapter called Selling Through Service. And I want to just sort of talk about, here's a fun trick that a lot of podcasters have figured out, but not all of them. If you're thinking about starting a show, you're thinking, oh, what are we going to talk about? And how many people can we get to follow? That's not the goal, folks. Sometimes the goal is to get your customers and make them on the show and make them look good so they feel really good, or get your prospects on the show as a way of breaking the ice. What did you do? You sold through service. You provided something of value that enabled them to then go, oh, maybe I should talk to them about doing business. As a podcaster, I will admit that there have been guests on this show that ended up joining Cmo Huddles or hired Renegade to do research because of the conversation. While it's nice to have downloads, really, this conversation is the conversation that matters. So it's a wonderful little insider tip on how to sell through service. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to dive deeper into how you took this expertise to make it work for your new company. Okay, we'll be right back. So I want to talk about Cmo Huddles for a second. Launched in 2020, Cmo Huddles has helped me learn one critical lesson. CMOs cannot outwork the job, no matter how many hours they put in. It's too damn hard. But CMOs can and are outsmarting it with the help of 100 plus peers, all dedicated to sharing, caring, and daring each other to greatness. One CMO described Cmo Huddles as timely conversations with smart peers in a trusted environment, while another called it a cross between an expert workshop and a therapy session. If you're a B2B CMO who can share, care, and dare with the best of them, visit cmohuddles.com or hit me up on LinkedIn to see if you qualify for a guest pass. Okay, we're back. And so, Josh, you got all this experience and you suddenly were at this intersection of client engagement and sales, and you became an asset of NASDAQ in helping them getting the deal, closing the deal. So now let's talk about the move to Redpoint and what attracted you to that.
Yeah. So I think like anybody during the pandemic, I had my share of downtime, right? Like I went from this crazy job of like working with companies on their IPO every single day and getting so excited about what we were going to do in Times Square or on billboards and like all of these different methods to promote their listing in the public markets to lockdown and being at home and feeling just a little stuck in terms of what I was going to do with my time. And while the markets were frozen, I kind of sat in ideation mode. And the first idea that I focused on was doing a show from home, knowing that my other show going on the road to offices was not going to be a thing. I had to come up with something different and differentiated. So going back to your pillars, similar to like, as you said, like, thinking about service, I was thinking, okay, well, I've already done the show on like what companies need when they're trying to get people to come to their office. But it seemed like there was this pivot in just the culture of people caring about working for companies that actually are trying to do good and are actually giving back in a meaningful way. So I came up with this new show idea called Mission Driven, which is a show I hosted for 2 years at NASDAQ during and then after the pandemic, where essentially I interviewed CEOs of purpose-led companies about how they give back to the world, how they think about their product as actually, moving us into a better direction. And it was really kind of even furthering of the idea of what I'd done before at NASDAQ, but then taking it to a whole nother level of purpose really was like a true attractor for kind of attracting the right types of companies to NASDAQ. And then, there I am in the IPO pitch being like, hey, remember me? We did this show about your being a purpose-led founder. And here you are at this moment. And here I'm going to tell you why you should choose us and how we can really guide you along that journey as a public company. After that moment, I think like everybody else, I had moments at home of just like thoughtfulness where I was dreaming up new ideas. And I came up with this idea that I had this really interesting opportunity because I've had so much knowledge from so many incredible founders, CMOs, CFOs, CIOs that have taught me so much, that have made me such a good, not only interviewer, but business person. And I think there's so much knowledge that just isn't out there for starting great businesses. I felt like so much of it was locked up in Silicon Valley, and the pandemic kind of bringing people to different parts of the country just made it even more kind of sporadic, and just like the knowledge, it spread it out even further. And I just felt like there was this opportunity for somebody to come in and start to deploy knowledge around building great businesses. And so I developed a pitch deck that I was going to take out to pretty much every venture capitalist that I knew, that was going to be essentially a media vehicle for learning entrepreneurship. And I was going to have, the greatest minds that I have known over the last decade teach their little learnings of their entrepreneurial journey, and be really, I'm a big show, not tell person. And I really wanted CEOs to focus on not the theory, but the practice of building businesses. And so that was what I was going to do. I took it to a few friends, one of them being one of my best friends, Logan Bartlett, who is at Redpoint Ventures. And I was like, look, I've got this great idea. I think I can really make this work. I'm not sure I would leave NASDAQ to do it. It might be like a side thing that's more of like just an extension of the giving back that I want to do with Mission Driven. And he was like, well, this is really cool, but in our business, in venture, we, like you with the New York Stock Exchange, need to differentiate ourselves from the pack. It's incredibly competitive to win the best deals. And content is increasingly becoming a part of that. And he kind of explained it to me in the streaming wars universe, that like venture capital kind of started in this, VHS and DVDs movement, but then once we moved into the streaming era, there were all these differentiated players with very bespoke niches, and a lot of them generating content. And I'd spent a lot of time with the venture industry, so I understood the landscape and the opportunity, but it wasn't until he convinced me that I really understood that I could bring this and some of the exciting things along with it into Redpoint as a partner.
So rather than start your own business, you went and joined them, which is cool. And that was a little more than almost a year ago.
Yeah, it was a little more. It was December of last year.
All right. Okay.
And I joined with being the marketer that I am very much with a very detailed plan, right? I came in with not just the pitch deck that I was going to take out to investors, but a more nuanced approach around the entire idea of how Redpoint could differentiate ourselves from the rest of the venture capital industry. It all kind of boiled down to this kind of ethos of everyone in VC takes themselves very seriously. And if you really want to democratize entrepreneurship, if you want to blow the lid off things, you actually have to make fun of yourself a little bit, take yourself a little less seriously. And I think it was actually through the interview process when I was talking with each one of these incredibly brilliant managing directors who run Redpoint, was that they all seemed really relatable. I dealt with a lot of VCs at NASDAQ where they had that kind of like robot Silicon Valley feel to the conversation. And that's not who these people were. These are real people who are kind of relate to, I think, the companies we work with in a different way. And that was what, as a marketer, was like, there's something here. There's a little bit of magic that I can spin into something much bigger.
I'm going to pause for a second because I got to let the folks that are doing their workout right now, let them breathe and take this in. What I'm hearing is a sense of courage on the point of Redpoint that they would actually differentiate themselves. They would dare to be different. They would dare to be distinct. And they would do it by having a personality and a voice that didn't take itself too seriously. Maybe not a jester or a joker brand, but close, but with a sense of humor, which is often missed in the B2B world. Certainly, you don't ever put the word VC and comedian next to each other.
Never.
Right. No, it's like, hey, what's your CAC? And let's talk in dollars and cents, not anything to do with what a lot of entrepreneurs feel is like, I'm starting something important here. Can we talk about that first? Which is interesting. Okay. So strategically, at least from a brand voice standpoint, you said we're going to talk differently. That's part one of the strategy. What else would you say were the strategic underpinnings of where you wanted to take Redpoint?
Yeah. So I think the biggest leap to get everybody on board with was hiring Rashad Asir, who's at Corporation on Instagram and TikTok, who everybody probably already subconsciously follows without even realizing it, is one of the kings of kind of, corporate comedy on the internet today. It's a pretty big leap to go from the typical venture firm that is mostly creating content that is kind of self-promotional, right, to going to making content that is humorous and perhaps poking fun at the industry and some of the outsized returns and some of the double speak and acronym talk and all of the things that happen in corporate America. And just to be willing to go out on that branch was just, I'm still impressed by our team's reception of it, but they've seen kind of in the months since he's joined, the incredible dividends. So the big leap was pushing the brand out into TikTok. There weren't really other VCs on TikTok. There were, perhaps one or two, but not really taking it all that seriously as a thing. And hiring someone full-time to do short form content, but also mentor our portfolio companies on how they can up their content game was a big step forward. And I think it's really shown. We hired him in January, and he's just taken the VC world by storm. It started with smaller follower gains in January, but it just went up in like an exponential fashion starting in around March of this year. We had a video on Instagram that has over 1 million views. We just crossed 10,000 followers on Instagram, and we're nearly at 20,000 on TikTok. And this is kind of interesting because it's almost a study in taking a brand that was really well known to a very, super intelligent cohort of technical founders, but then kind of lifting the lid off the brand and saying, now we're going to expose this not just to the technical founder, but to every founder, and then not just to every founder, but all millennials and Gen Z, and really see how the brand evolves when it's taking up that much more space. And it's really paid off. I mean, we get founders now that email us saying, oh my gosh, your TikTok high is so funny. Or I really related to this. It's just like what it used to be working at whatever company the video was in. So it's this like game-changing thing that has not just shifted our perception, but kind of gone back to that underpinnings of like, how do we make a venture firm that doesn't take itself too seriously, but also has seriously intelligent things to say and incredible knowledge to give out, but that we can kind of appeal to the Gen Z millennial demographic that really just appreciates things to be a little bit sillier.
Love the differentiation by tone and voice clearly. And again, I am now all in on you. You are definitely a, what would be called a Joker brand archetype. Very cool, unexpected. TikTok also, kudos for being there first. I can imagine that some of the listeners are saying, that's cool, but anecdotes are nice, but what about, leads, deals, other metrics that might matter to a CFO or CEO?
Absolutely. And look, I mean, it is not for the faint of heart. It's a bold move, right? If you want to decide all of a sudden that you want to shitpost as a brand, I mean, could you imagine what it took for Wendy's to start doing what they did on Twitter, right? It is a Herculean thing to do it, particularly at a big, and I worked with every A-list public company that you can think of to decide to do that with your brand and to be bold enough to make that choice. But I can tell you that the payoff, at least on the ROI side, is pretty high from a brand awareness perspective, not just in the industry, but it's pretty hard to become a press darling without moving the needle in a big way. And I think we managed to get a lot of news. We've been quoted in numerous stories now just about kind of our forward-facing content initiatives. And I think that's something that just wouldn't have happened organically without this initiative or some of these types of things. Because let me tell you that some of the other things that I've launched, while they're incredible, they don't necessarily are going to get the fanfare that, Rashad on TikTok gets, or when we launched Logan's podcast, Cartoon Avatars, that it really is a weekly digest of what happened on tech Twitter, but also kind of interviews with some really incredible Herculean figures in the tech industry.
There's just such a great reminder of, if you want to get PR, if you want to get news, you got to do something newsworthy. But when you do, particularly in a state industry, it really, because it's like, oh my God, there's somebody different in a category. And we were joking with financial service firms are like all blue or red. I mean, that's it. I interviewed a guy who just decided, okay, we're going to be something different, maybe orange, whatever it was. I mean, just the value of differentiation cannot be underestimated, and doing it in a way that is, of course, newsworthy. So I've had CEOs, I've actually heard someone say, not that I believe this, that you can't eat awareness. And what fundamentally, I believe they're wrong, because every time you are presenting Redpoint now, if they've heard of you, oh, you're the guys that you have a way in. And if they haven't heard of you, you're one of, oh, we're a VC firm. You're a generic. You were just a VC firm. Talk a little bit about how awareness, besides turning into PR, is actually turning into either enabling doors to be open or enabling doors, deals to be closed.
Yeah, that is such a good point. You really can't eat awareness, right? And you can't also bet the farm on it either. I also would say, the most interesting thing about this is that we now have companies coming to us saying, can you help us with our content strategy, right? This is not just about brand awareness. This is us actually showing our future portfolio companies, here's how we can help you. Look at what we've done for us. We can help you in those early innings of whether you're a seed stage company and your idea is just getting off the ground, or your Series A and you need help kind of putting getting a big outsized return on that first big funding announcement and your go-to-market. All these things are things that we can accelerate with our team at Redpoint. And so this is kind of the way I think about it. You use brand awareness to showcase expertise. And the reason people are going to come to us and choose us, I hope, is, and I think we'll hear it a lot more, and we've been starting to hear it, is hey, we want to learn from you guys how you get all this free engagement, especially now, right? We are in an economy where everything is super tight, right? The most important thing is free marketing, free PR, free brand awareness. Look at also what's changed in the game, right? Apple, as a result of all of their, their privacy focus, has really taken a lot of the meat away from doing a Facebook or Instagram ad. And so if you think about the reduced value of paid advertising over the last couple of years, coupled with the pullback in the economy and people just trying to be tighter with their belts overall, what other way could you really just focus and capture a little bit more attention for yourselves than doing what we're doing? And so we actually led a workshop. Rashad had one on like TikTok for brands, and we'll take companies in our portfolio and out of our portfolio through some of these strategies around building brand and and building your brand awareness amongst your competitors.
Sure. Another example of selling through service. But I think the thing that I really want to emphasize, put a pin in, if you will, is that you can be, and brands need to be, when it's appropriate, your own best case history. Judge our firm. If you come and we, and choose to invest you and you let us invest in you, we're going to bring all the expertise of marketing that you're going to need to the table. So it becomes a differentiator, and then you back it up with service. So there is an argument to be made always to be your best case history, and whatever that means, right? And in this case, you're providing that. So we're going to take a quick break, and then when we come back, we're going to sort of wrap up with some of the most important lessons that you've learned along the way. Okay, we'll be right back. Have you thought about doing some market research, but didn't have the manpower or expertise on your team to make sure your research was methodologically valid, insight-rich, and newsworthy? Research can be a tent pole for an entire quarter's worth of marketing activities. Research that your SDRs can use to help move a lead into an opportunity. It's a lot to ask for market research. And by the way, we might even be able to sneak in some awareness studies into that research, which is why more and more B2B marketers are coming to Renegade for help in this area. Renegade will help you craft the questionnaire, field the research, analyze the results, and even write up and design the report if your in-house team is too busy. If you're a B2B CMO, even thinking about market research, do yourself a favor, visit renegade.com and set up a time for us to chat. Okay, we're back. So you've got the brand voice, you're doing a lot that differentiates your brand. One question that I always like to ask, have you tried anything that just didn't work?
That is such a good question. So I'll take you on a little journey. So we hired Rashad in January with launching TikTok and social, and then we created Cartoon Avatars, Logan's podcast that's doing tremendously well and is building like a real community online. Then I started experimenting a lot with doing kind of Twitter spaces with founders in the industry. And it was one of those things where instinctively I thought that this was going to be a great place for us to play. I love Twitter. Twitter's like a second home to me. It's always where I get my information. And particularly with like the kind of downfall of Clubhouse, I kind of felt like Twitter was uniquely positioned to sort of take that live conversation moment. And so we did a few of them, and there was a couple that did well, but not enough to justify the investment of investors' time, researching. You know how much time, Drew, it takes to put together like all the questions before you do an interview of someone. Like there's just a whole lot of investment beyond just like the tangible costs that make things not worth your time. And when we could be cutting cartoon avatars into all these short form pieces and putting them out across TikTok and Instagram and LinkedIn and all these other places, versus investing our time into doing something like another Twitter space that had low tune in, it was one of those things where I was like, I really wanted it to work. I really believe in the platform. And I wish that they presented the offering in a way that made it easier to tune into the ones you want, not the ones you don't. But it was just one of those things where it was like, look, this is not working. When I launched our new show, Founder Confidential, a few weeks ago, my biggest worry was that it wasn't going to work on short form social, that we'd made this brand where all of the cartoon avatars bites are somewhat humorous. All of Rashad's like incredible work is for the most part humorous. And we know that that's working on TikTok and Instagram Reels because we see it. But the jump of, is edutainment going to work? Are people going to want to learn how to build a company based on short form insights on TikTok and Reels? That was what I was most worried about not working, but it actually seems to be working pretty well. It's not working as well as the humor content, but as you think about Redpoint, we can't just be about humor, right? We have to also be about providing founder knowledge, investor knowledge. We need to be sharing all of the insights that we can to really draw in those best founders that understand our points of differentiation, that we can be the first call to that incredible founder who knows that our investors have the knowledge to help them, but also that we have the team to help amplify their messaging and really get their message out in, the biggest and widest way we can.
Yeah, I mean, putting on my brand hat for a second, I would say that humor is a secret weapon that is breaking the ice and making you a very likable company, which, again, likable and VC are not always words that are put together. Shark might be a word that would be put together, right? So if you're creating the most likable VC firm in the world, then I think that can inform everything that you do. And whether short form or long form. And that gets me to another question I was just thinking about, because you've developed various properties and you've listed them on the show, and you've elected to have different brand names for each of those. And I'm just curious, the decision on that relative to, say, trying to keep them closer to Redpoint or trying to sort of tie them together a little bit more.
It was actually something I learned at NASDAQ when I was naming the show, for Mission Driven. If it was NASDAQ's Mission Driven, might not have gotten every private company CEO to sign on to it, because maybe it would have scared them away saying, oh, like this means we're listing with you and not listing with the New York Stock Exchange. And I would say, no, don't do it for that. Do it because I'm a great marketer and I can help you. But this show is just called Mission Driven. It's about purpose-led founders, and it doesn't indicate whether you've made a decision or not.
Got it.
And I think one of my core tenets is that, like, brand is kind of a dirty word. And as soon as you put the brand on top of whatever you were trying to say, it immediately either confuses the consumer or makes them feel disingenuous. And one of the things that we've learned most with doing all this work with Gen Z and millennial audiences is that their number one thing is authenticity. They don't want all the smoke and mirrors. They don't want to feel like they're being sold a line, and they certainly don't want anything cringy. And those are kind of the core things that I've learned from this next generation. And particularly in my role, my prior role, I was always, what's the next thing? What's the next generation getting excited about? Because those were going to be the future products that were going to go public with us. So I really had to live in this zeitgeist world. And I think it's taught me how to think like the consumer I'm marketing to.
Nothing cringy, just putting an emphasis on
Nothing
that.
cringy.
Nothing cringy. Okay, we can do that. What is next? What's on the horizon?
Oh my gosh, so much. So Rashad has a show in development he's going to be interviewing incredible creators from the creator economy. I'm working on a new show called 10 Tabs, where I'm going to go back to some of my favorite CEOs that I've taken public and just ask them what's in their Chrome browser and what they're working on. And then we have a future podcast coming up with two of our female investors that I'm really excited to, called The Company You Keep, all about building incredible and dynamic teams. So it's more around the theater of entrepreneurship, knowledge, entertainment, more of what we're doing. We're going to do a second season of Founder Confidential and continue to just create more content for that generation of future founders that are coming up.
Very cool. I want to go back to the short form, long form thing, because it's funny. So I'm going to say about 3 months ago, we took Renegade Marketers Unite, and we have this other property called Tuesday Tips. And we just put the Tuesday Tips, which are 3 to 5 minute little snippets, in our feed. The result was remarkable in that it attracted so many younger listeners, and who then went back to the back catalog and sort of, oh, I'm interested in that. Oh, I'm interested in that. And so I think there is, let's face it, if you have a subject, like you and I are talking about a whole marketing program in your life, your thing, it's hard to do. You're not going to do that in 3 minutes, but it's worth listening to because you get to hear the whole story. So I think the point and the things that you're talking about of having bite-sized content, but not relying on it 100%, it totally makes sense. I mean, the notion that nobody listens or reads long form content is silly. They just may not consume it right away at that moment. And it may not be the way you get the conversation started with them. You got to give them an appetizer before the main course, I think, is the analogy.
Absolutely, Drew. And if you ever want to talk to another incredible renegade marketer, my friend Brendan Gahan, who has an like a huge TikTok following now, is actually, I think, one of the core experts in this exact area. And he actually just wrote a piece on it, which was that you're seeing that essentially short form content doesn't mean they're not tuning in for the long form content. It's that appetizer. It means if they watch 4 or 5 of those short form pieces from the long form piece, they're coming over to YouTube. They're coming over to your website. They're coming there for that longer form content. It doesn't mean that long form content is dead. It just means that short form video is the way that the modern consumer decides they actually will give the time of day to the long form content.
Yeah. Start me right, and then we'll get going. If I like you. And again, this is where a sense of humor, do I like you, and likability is so underestimated as the icebreaker for brands. It sounds like you have a culture of experimentation, that you're allowed to take chances and try things, which is amazing. You've already shared an example of something didn't work. Let's wrap up with, so CMOs are thinking, they're hearing about all of this, and they're saying, our target's not on TikTok. Our target's not on Instagram. They're not there yet. What do you have to say to them?
You know, that is such an easy question to answer, because it's the same thing I've been seeing in the marketplace for, my 10 years as a marketer. The next generation, if you think about why Mercedes-Benz advertises on Snapchat and TikTok, it's not because that 14 or 15 or 16-year-old is going to go out and buy a Mercedes-Benz, but it's when they can afford it. When they're in their 20s and 30s, they want them to think of Mercedes-Benz as the car that they want, that they aspire to own. And so if you think about it, we're thinking the same way. I might be advertising right now about Redpoint to the future founders who are 14, 15, and maybe they're not starting a company for 4 or 5 years or 6 or 7 years, but I'm hoping and banking that when they do, they're going to be like, oh, I learned pretty much everything I know about starting companies from the Redpoint TikTok.
Interesting. And I push back a little on that, because again, I talk to so many CMOs, and they're going to say 6 years from now, that horizon's too long for me. It shouldn't be. And they might even say that horizon's too long for my CFO and CRO. So unless you work with folks that are really interested in building a long-term company, they're going to say, you got to give me something that I can work with that's going to have an impact in 1 and 2. I could live with impact with 1 and 2 years. Is there something that we can point to that would say, yeah, we're having impact in weeks, so we're not having to rely on those kids growing up into being in customers? I'm just trying to help these folks experiment.
So for my
more.
target demo, it totally does. Because, the typical founder is, anywhere from 20 to 35 or so, right? So even if you're thinking about the millennial demographic, which is a big consumer of both TikTok and Instagram Reels content, that person is 41 years old, right? Like, these are not young people we're necessarily talking about. We're just saying, if you're not on these 2 platforms, engaging with people in a human way, that you might be missing out on this huge market potential to market to your potential customers in a human way. And then what I would say about that younger demographic, anytime people forget about advertising to people in high school is always going to be that demographic that is what's setting the culture, right? So it's like, it's high school kids talking to their parents about what the hot thing is, right? Like, even if it's you're advertising to Gen Z, you're actually just advertising to younger millennials and Gen X. And that's the way I think about things, is that word of mouth with this is a huge, huge generator. We're not seeing, for the most part, people that are, super young just engaging with Rashad's TikTok content, but, kind of across the spectrum.
And, I also think there's probably a notion of, it's not, TikTok isn't universally young. And those that are, say, millennials that are on TikTok, they're certainly going to be the right kind of folks, because they're going to be pressing the envelope a little bit, so forth. They are maybe early adopters or whatever. Okay. So I'm going to quickly summarize. You heard here, Katz: courageous, artful, thoughtful, and scientific. Courageous strategy, just saying we're not going to be like every VCs. We're going to hire a Josh to help build us basically media properties that are unique in the category. The artful part of it is doing these different properties that they've developed and recognizing that putting the brand on it would actually be a problem. The thoughtful part is really thinking about how they can help their customers grow their businesses. And then the scientific part, well, building awareness matters. And you can see it at the end of the day, it does show up. The guy who said you can't eat awareness is wrong. You can. It grows the business relative to any company that you've never heard of. Those salespeople, those people struggle. Okay.
Awareness is delicious.
Awareness is delicious. So thank you, Josh. Really great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Drew. It has been such a pleasure. I'm such a fan. Thank you so much for having me on.
And thank you, listeners. If you found this episode of value, if it sparked some thinking, please thank our guest, Josh Machiz, on LinkedIn, and do me a favor and rate us on your favorite podcast app. Renegade Marketers Unite is now a production of Share Your Genius. Melissa Caffrey is our content director. The music is by the amazing Burns Twins, and the intro voiceover is Linda Cornelius. To find the transcripts of all episodes, suggest future guests, or learn more about my latest book in the savviest B2B marketing boutique in New York City, visit renegade.com. I'm your host, Drew Neiser, and until next time, keep those renegade thinking caps on and strong.